Hello, this is Father Len McMillan, and I'm making a little video for our first communicants, just going through the connection in the Bible between the Eucharist and the Bible. And so I want to tell the story of Abraham, and Abraham is called to leave everything familiar behind and start a completely new life. And God says that He will give him the promised land and make him this huge family, and through his family will bless the entire world. So when God asks him to leave everything familiar behind, what Abraham says to God is, here I am. And what God asked in Hebrew is lach lahai, go deep. Now that's going to be repeated by Jesus, but Abraham says, here I am. And so he makes this journey to the promised land. But it's kind of funny because Abraham asked God, well, where do you want me to go? God says, I'll tell you later. Just go and trust. And then he asks, well, how do I get there? And he says, I'll tell you that later. Just go. Trust me. And then he says, what about this son? When will I have this son? And he says, I'll tell you later. Just trust me. And so Abraham begins to walk and trust. And I just want to say, well, how does that relate to the Eucharist? Well, one of the Hebrew words for worship actually is the root word for leg, and this in the sense of using your legs to walk. So Hebrew worship actually starts with walking. And if you notice at the Eucharist, Mass always starts with this idea of walking to the sanctuary. It symbolizes us walking to the promised land of heaven. But it also means that we're always trying to leave our old way of living behind and starting this whole new way of living with God. So the odd part, when Abraham gets to the promised land, what do you think the first thing that he does is? Oddly enough, if it was me, I would probably, first thing I'd do is build a house or a home or a city. But Abraham does nothing like that ever. The first thing he does when he enters the promised land is to build an altar to God next to a tree. And the tree is called vision. I just love that. So the tree behind me, I love that little tree. And my name for that tree is vision. And so you get this theme that Abraham, he never builds a home. All he ever does is build an altar next to a tree, usually on a mountaintop. That's the first thing he does. The second thing he does is build an altar. The third thing he does is build an altar. And you'll never guess the fourth thing that Abraham does. He builds an altar and tree and mountaintop. He builds nothing for himself. So it raises the question, well, what is an altar? Well, an altar is technically a type of table. An altar is used for worship in order to have a sacrificial meal with God. That's what altars are. Altars are used in worship from this point on for the rest of the Bible. So until the very end of the Bible, when it speaks about heaven, guess what's in the center of heaven? An altar. And all the angels and the saints that gather around it. And how this relates to the Eucharist. As parents, I want you to explain to your kids, oh, wow, the beginning of religion with Abraham, it starts with an altar. So you can explain, part of the reason why we process into Mass is that we act out Abraham. We're journeying to the promised land of heaven. We're promising to always be leaving our old way of life behind and growing closer a little bit more to the way of heaven. Secondly, explain, as Abraham gathered around an altar, we gather around an altar. As all those in heaven gather around an altar to worship, we gather around an altar to worship. And then explain to him, the same way a tree and altar always go together, well, same way in the Catholic Church. We have an altar at the center here at St. Pius, and then right next to the altar is this huge cross. Sounds kind of strange, but in the word for tree and cross are the same word in Hebrew. So, like Abraham, it's tree and altar. We've been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. So on their first communicant, they should know that, we're not making this stuff up. This is how the Bible commands us to worship. So God bless, and next week we'll talk about Abraham again.